Jeff Turnbull's trying to tell me something. I just ignore him. It's when my wife did something there's something going on. I got to pay attention. And Turnbull, man. I said it's been a crazy week, and I don't know if things are going to change a lot over the coming month. It's very difficult to say how everything is going to pan out. We do know that God is in control, and so I'd like to start off with a prayer. I think it is very important that's the one thing that we keep in mind here as we, as a church body and as a state and as a country and really as a world as we go through this is that the importance of prayer. And as we talk about some of this lesson as we've been going through on the story, that's one of the things that it's always an overriding theme, isn't it? Is the importance of prayer and the people that pray when things get difficult. And so I think that's the way we should start off today. I also think that you keep that in mind as we go through this. Is don't underestimate the power of prayer. And we don't know what's going to happen, but we do know that we can take our case to God and that He listens to us. So let's pray. Heavenly Father, we just are thankful that you bring our congregation together today and that we still can do this. And we just pray today, and we're going to continue to pray, Lord, that your hand is over everything and that it's your will that's going to happen. And we just pray, Lord, that to be honest, we pray for an end to this. We pray that or that a cure for it, or it ends because of the summer and the sun, but whatever the case may be, is that you protect us. We protect your people. We ask that you would just keep us in good health and just do the right things and reach out to those in need. And so we just ask this and lift up not only that, but today's message. And we ask all this in your Son's holy and precious name. Amen. One thing, before I get started with my presentation, I do want to mention this too, because there is the deacons and elders and Brian and others as well have been in conversation over this last week about precautions that we need to take and just different things that are common sense things that we can do here to protect everyone. And so one of the things we've suspended outside communion for a while. The nursing home is kind of closed to visitors, the hospital, and all this. So don't think that we don't take all this serious. We've had a very serious discussion about communion itself and things we might be doing down the road to continue to give communion, but things that we might do differently that would just be precautionary. So do understand that we are talking about it, and so some things may change, but they're all in your best interest and in the best interest of the church. And we're also, as that same group is kind of getting together and talking about some things that we'd just as soon not talk about, things like active shooter training and different things like that. You just don't want to have to talk about those things as a church, but they need to be. Things have happened, and we are going to talk about them, and hopefully those will be the type of things that you won't even notice, but we're going to do them anyway. So just keep that in mind. With that being said, we continue this week out of the story, and today we look at chapter 8. The chapter 8 is titled "A Few Good Men and Women." When I saw the title of this chapter, I tried to recall the movie "A Few Good Men," and in particular the most famous line from that movie, because every line has a famous line. And you might recall Jack Nicholson's famous retort to Tom Cruise when Tom Cruise said, request about the truth, what is the truth? And when Jack Nicholson said, and I'm going to do this, you can't handle the truth, and he said it a little more emphatic than that, but it was kind of nasty, and I didn't want to show it. The reason I bring that up is the judge in this case, and I'm assuming, I think that's the guy on the bottom picture there, he had his hands full with this case, because you've got a young, kind of energetic guy with Tom Cruise in this case, who was seeking the truth, but yet he wasn't really part of the establishment, if you will, and Jack Nicholson, someone who had put his life on the line for his country and was part of the establishment, and there was this conflict, and the judge said somehow in this case try to control this mess that was going on. And so, it kind of ties in with today's lesson in a way, in that, we're going to talk about Judges today. The lesson we've got is from Judges. There's, I think, 2 to 4, and then 6 to 8, and then it goes on, it kind of skips to the end of 13 to 16 on this, or where it's from out of the book of Judges. But these were the judges that were raised up by God after the death of Joshua, which is where we left off last week, was with the death of Joshua. So, maybe a better quote to use as an introduction would be this one from George Washington that says, "It is infinitely better to have a few good men than many indifferent ones." And I think that is so true, not only of the judges in this case, but it's true of us as well. As we left off last week, Joshua had the Israelites, or he led the Israelites out of the desert and into the promised land, and he died at the age of 110 and was buried in the land of his inheritance. And the last paragraph of chapter 7 said, Israel served the Lord throughout the lifetime of Joshua and of the elders who outlived him and who had experienced everything the Lord had done for Israel. A very important part of that paragraph, and one that's enlightening as we begin chapter 8, is who experienced everything the Lord had done for Israel. You had to keep in mind, that Joshua's now dead, the elders, many of the other people that had experienced all these things about leading them out of Egypt and through the desert, they're dead. They're gone. And now, who is going to lead that? So, it's a couple things about that line. First of all, the people that were left after that, or the people that had died, rather, they had lived through the downside, they had lived through the upside. I mean, there were many good things, the miracles that the Lord had done for them, the provisions that He had for them, and they were able to appreciate it in one sense, but they also understood the downside of it, meaning that they had suffered along with the whole group, and so there was just an understanding there. But what it doesn't say, but it does, okay, is that the next generation had not experienced those things. Or to put it another way, they weren't taught those things that they should have been. Okay? It bothers me a little bit today with all the criticism of our youth today, or even somewhat of the millennials. It's not so much that their life is different than ours was, or just that I always think, and I put my family up here, one side of it, because, I start thinking about this, and who taught my kids? Or I think of my kids, and they're teaching their grandkids, our grandkids, and they're teaching them. And who taught our kids? Oh, I taught them, or we taught them. And who taught me? Well, my mom and our parents taught us. Well, who taught them? Well, our grandparents, their parents taught them. So, if you think about that, well, if something didn't get taught along the way, whose fault is that? That finger always has a way of pointing right back to us, doesn't it? And the reason I bring that up here is because today's lesson kind of gets into a little bit about that. If the people that were left, that were coming up and are going to be the leaders now, if they didn't know what they experienced on that, whose fault is that? It's very easy to blame as we go through this, because you think, well, why didn't they know? And you're going to hear me repeat the same thing over and over again, because, to be honest with you, the same thing is repeated over and over again in the chapter. Granted, times are different and change is happening at an ever-increasing rate, and it's hard to keep up. Parenting changes as time change. I think parenting today is tough, but it's never been an easy thing. It's just different. Okay? Well, times they were a-changing once the Israelites got to the promised land also. Joshua's dead, and there were so many of the people that had gone through the slavery, wandering through the desert, and all the suffering that had accompanied that journey. And sure enough, this roller coaster ride that the Israelites, crying out to God, being rescued, turning away, suffering, crying out to God, being rescued again and again, was about to continue. It wasn't going to change. And these chapters of Judges are the biblical text for today's lesson, and it centers on Judges, the judges that were raised up by the Lord to lead the people. So we begin with the first generation after the death of Joshua, and it says they knew neither the Lord nor what he had done for Israel. The Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord and served the Baals. They worship gods, the people around them, the Baals, the Baals, the Ashereths. And a disclaimer at this point, if I mispronounce any of these things, you excuse me, or either that or you don't know. I figure if you don't know either, then I'm right and you're wrong. But because of this, they were turned over to the hands of their enemies. And just as in the past, and it just was done before, Israel suffered, and they called out to God in relief. I mean, it said that, I'm going to say that a bunch today, because it just happens over and over again. And if you read the Bible, you know that this is the case. And at times you think, gosh, won't they learn? But we're like them, aren't we? So in this case, the Lord raised up judges to save them from the hands of the raiders. Not that it did a lot of good, because the people listened, and then they didn't. And the pattern was consistent. The judges would save them out of the hands of their enemies, and the people would listen, but then the judge would die, and then they would return to their old ways. In fact, they were even more corrupt than their ancestors. In other words, it got a little worse each time. So I want to mention some of these, the few judges. I'm not going to go into great detail on all this, and I know this is small, but maybe you can read that. But rather than expand on every one of these, the judges that came about, I thought I'd just put it kind of in a timeline for you there. And it starts off with, it said they were sold in the hands of Cushan Rishathaim, king of Aram Naharaim. See, I got that right. And it says they were subject to him for 8 years. Then the Israelites cried out, and in this case Othniel, son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother, saved them, and they had peace for 40 years. And so then they turned away and were again subject to oppression. This time the Moabite leader Eglon They suffered for 18 years. The Israelites cry out, are delivered by a judge, Ehud, who tricked Eglon and killed him, he was the enemy in this case, and they had peace for 80 years. The Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord after Ehud's death, and they were turned over to Jabin, king of Canaan, and his commander Sisera. It says Deborah this time, one of the women I'm going to mention here was leading Israel at the time. One thing I want to mention about that, I just want you to be aware of the years and the timeline on this, and I don't know if this has a lot of significance or not. It's just something that stood out to me, is that the Israelites suffered and they cried out to the Lord, and then they suffered for a period of years. And then when they cried out and he saved them and they had the judge, is another period of years. And there's a significant difference, you notice, between the period that they suffered and the period that they were not suffering, or they had peace. On that, and that kind of continues throughout this text, is that God was good to them, and when they obeyed and they did what He said, then they had peace, and they had it for a significant amount of time. But if you ask anybody, that's going through suffering or going through hard times, they will tell you that those hard times, that 8 years may have seemed like 40. Okay, and that's just kind of the nature of it. So how does Deborah's story differ from what we have seen so far and what we've seen in these other cases here? Is that, number one, is she's a woman, she's a judge, she's a prophet, and evidently trusted because the people would take their disputes to her to be settled. So, and Deborah received instructions from God. She told a man that's named Barak to take 10,000 men to Mount Tabor, where the Lord would deliver the enemy, in this case mentioned up there as Sisera, and the second to last bullet point there. And Sisera would be delivered into his hands. Now, but Barak was not given the honor of killing Sisera. That honor would go to someone else that was seemingly very undeserving, a woman named Jael. And she, if you read the story, and I'm going to leave out a bunch of this, and I'm assuming that you all took the time to read the chapter this week, but she was a woman who was actually part of the enemy, but she tricked this Sisera into thinking he was getting rest in her tent, and she ends up driving a stake through his head and killing him. And so that's how Barak in this case finds out that the enemy is dead, is that he encounters this woman. She says, "Come on in, I'll show you what I did." And there he is, dead. And so Deborah in this case, it was the leader, and she told the military leader, Barak in this case, what to do, and he did that. And so following that victory, Israel had 40 years of peace then after Deborah. And it's interesting from the text at that point that it says, another strong leader was needed, but the roster seemed empty. I thought that was interesting, that, okay, who now? And seemingly there was no one that was going to take her place, and the cycle begins again. In this case, it would be the Midianites and the Amalekites and other eastern people that would invade and torment the Israelites. They camped, and if you read that, you saw that they camped on the land, they ruined the crops, they killed their livestock, they impoverished the people. It was so bad that the Israelites themselves, rather than just take it where they're at, they said they prepared shelters in mountain clefts, in caves and strongholds. But what do you suppose they did next? Cried out to the Lord. In this case, the Lord kind of lectures them a little bit before He saves them. He kind of lectures them a little bit, and I can, having delivered many lectures in my life. He said, I can just hear him saying this, is that, I brought you up out of Egypt, out of slavery in Egypt. I rescued you from the Egyptians and from all those that oppressed you. I drove out their enemies, gave you their land. I told you I am the Lord your God. You must not worship other gods, the Amorites, in whose land you now live. But you haven't listened. You haven't listened to me. Can you hear, kids, can you hear your parents in this case, lecturing in this case? And he does, he does lecture them a little bit, but what does he do? He delivers them. He listens. And he picks a farmer, not a decorated soldier, but he picks Gideon. And this is one of the two that today, no matter whether you read the chapter or not, I think most of you have probably heard of Gideon, and you'll hear of the next one coming up. But can you, what does God do? He said he picks a farmer, not a decorated soldier. Can you picture this? Gideon, a farmer, threshing wheat, and an angel of the Lord appears to him and said, "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." And I can see Gideon say, "Excuse me? I am a farmer. I'm threshing wheat here. I'm a lowly person, mighty warrior. Are you serious?" Not only does Gideon question the mighty warrior part, but he questions God's motive. He says, if the Lord is with us, why has all this happened to us? Where are all the wonders that our ancestor told us about? And now we have been abandoned and turned over to Midian. So he questions God, and he questions God's motive a little bit in this case. But what does the Lord tell him? Go. Ever heard that before? Just go. And Gideon does not go easily, though. In fact, he questions how he can save Israel. For one thing, it isn't going to be him that does it, but he questions how he can save Israel. He says his clan is the weakest. He's the least in his family, so he's not only questioning, about himself and how Israel could do it, but about himself, how I'm the least. Surely there's brothers and sisters that are better than me in this case that can handle this. That matters very little to God. Okay, he tells Gideon that he will be with him, striking down the Midianites, leaving none alive, and that's what he tells him. At that point, Gideon, again, not giving up easily. In this case, Gideon does what most of us would do, and that he asks for a sign or some sort of proof that he's hearing correctly. And the Lord does provide a sign. The first one is a fiery consumption of meat and bread, but that's not enough for God. This miracle happened that this food was there, and bam, it comes down, a fire, and thing is gone. No, that's not quite good enough. That's good, and he even questioned, seeing it and saying, questioning whether he should be alive because he saw this. But I said there's more. This case, Gideon goes on to ask God for a sign as proof. The first time he tells God, he says, I'll place a wool fleece on the threshing floor. And he says, if there is dew only on the fleece and all the ground is dry, then I will know that you will save Israel by my hand, as you have said. And of course, that's what happens. He does it. He places there, and sure enough, the fleece has dew. The ground is dry. In fact, it says that there was so much dew on the fleece that they filled a bowl of water from that fleece. But so that should be enough, right? No, and I touched my face. Don't. No, Gideon asked for another sign. This time the ground will be wet from the dew, and the fleece will be dry. And sure enough, that's what happened. So, I did a little bit of research on this about the fleece and just this whole idea and what it means. And I'm not talking in this case about a wool fleece, but this fleece says, at first I thought of the definition of fleeced, and most of you can probably relate to this. If someone says they're fleeced, you think of them as being deceptively robbed or cheated in some way. However, this really is different. In this case, it means something different. And according to what I found, a fleece is seeking to learn the will of God by means of a predetermined sign. People generally use a fleece when they come to a point of decision and don't know what to do. For example, maybe you're faced with a job offer and you don't know whether to say yes or no. So you say to God, please give me a sign. Anybody ever done this? Shake your head. You're putting out a fleece. You're putting out a fleece when you say to God, God, I am asking you to give me a sign, and this sign is and this is the sign I want you to give me. Okay? It's that second part that really qualifies as putting out a fleece. It's not just asking for guidance. It's when you say, Lord, I want you to do such and such, and if you will do what I have asked, I will know what your will is. That's a fleece. Okay? And, Gideon knew exactly what the God wanted him to do. God had told him, here's what I want you to do, and you're the one that's going to do it. The fleece in this case was simply to confirm God's will, not to determine God's will. It was to confirm it. And so he actually says as much in Judges 36:37. And I put that up. Well, I did not. I didn't put it up there. It says I did. I'll read it to you, but it says, if you will save Israel by my hand as you have promised, and this is Gideon talking, then I will know that you will save Israel by my hand as you said. So, he's telling them, if you will save them by my hand as promised, then I will know that this is what you want me to do. So no matter what conclusion you come to about the modern practice of fleecing, remember that originally it was used to confirm God's will and not to determine it. Gideon was one of the most fearful men in the Bible. Although he was a great hero, he was also filled with fear. In the 20th century term, he was a man with a low self-image. He didn't feel very good about himself. He didn't feel very good about his possibilities in this case at all. I mean, again, he said, I'm a farmer, I'm not a warrior. How are you going to deliver the enemy into my hands, me, a lowly person? So it said he didn't have a high self-image. But despite God's word on the matter, Gideon doubted that God could use him to deliver Israel, but that's exactly what God did. You really have to appreciate how God leads Gideon to victory, though. The first thing he tells him is that you have too many men. Can you hear Gideon on this one? Too many men? I mean, you're leading me. I don't know what I'm doing anyway, and this is the men I've got, which is probably not as many as the enemy's got, and you say I have too many men? The thing is, God did not want the Israelites to think that it was their own strength that's going to win this battle, or that won the battle. So he tells Jerubbaal, who is Gideon, that anyone who trembles with fear may turn back and leave Mount Gilead. So out of these men, he's saying, if you got anybody trembling with fear in this case, let them go. Okay, let them go. They don't have to fight. And it says that 22,000 men left, leaving only 10,000. Then God tells him, still too many. You still got too many men. And so those of you who are old timers and have drank water from places that you'd just as soon not talk about, out of a stock tank or something like that, maybe, you have to appreciate God's next instructions on reduction in force. He tells Gideon to take the men down to the water, and those who lap the water with their tongues like dogs will be your men. If they kneel down and drink, let them go. Go home. Tell them to go home. And, of course, that's what he does. 300 men lap the water like dogs, and that's the men that would go into battle, would be those 300. again, from Gideon's standpoint of self-confidence, he can't be feeling great at this point because he's went from over 30,000 men down to 300. He still lacks in self-confidence. But then God tells him something to do in this case, and that is, he says that if you're still afraid, go down to the outpost of the enemy. Go down to their tent and just listen. Listen to the enemy. And so Gideon does what he's instructed to do in this case, and he hears a conversation between two Midianites that essentially predict their own defeat. But they tell, one of them has a dream, and he pictures this big, I'm going to say bale. It's not a bale, but it was some sort of agricultural product, a huge one that rolls down and wipes out the camp. And so the other person that was with him interprets that dream, and he interprets it to mean that that the Midianites are going to be defeated. That essentially they're not only going to be defeated, they're going to be completely wiped out. Gideon hears the dream and the interpretation, and it says he fell down and worshipped. That's one of those little aha moments probably that once he heard that, this fear that he had, and then the uncertainty that he felt about himself as well as just the battle is gone. He falls down and he worships. And God tells him, get up. The Lord has given the Midianite camp into your hands. And that's what happened. I'm not going to go into how the battle proceeded. That you can read that. It's an interesting read about how they divide up into groups, and they have jars, they have torches, and this essentially, I guess you can get the picture that the group the Midianites are going to feel like they're surrounded, and there's a lot more people than they are, and so they run scared, and all of a sudden they're killing themselves, and so that's how it goes. You said you can read that, and that in the book. So it happens. The Midianites are defeated, and Israel had peace for 40 years after that. So guess what happens next? Gideon dies. The Israelites turn away from God. This time, they prostitute themselves to the Baals. They're delivered into the hands of the Philistines. And I hope you have read how the next leader comes forth. I'm not going to elaborate, but I know that you all know this person, or if nothing else, maybe you've seen the movie like me, which if you haven't seen it, I'd encourage you to watch it. At least the one that I watched is very accurate. Seemingly it told the story of Samson. And so said I could talk a lot about Samson. I'm not going to go into great detail on it because you know a lot of that. But, Samson was born of a woman that was barren. But he becomes the next leader to deliver Israel. And this time he's going to deliver them from the Philistines. So young Samson, as you know, wild, unusually strong, became a man with a secret. And that secret, of course, was his head was never to be touched by a razor. And his hair was his strength. And again, I hope that you read that and know how God uses Samson. He uses him to get into the Philistines, and he, just to summarize it real quickly, he asked to be with a woman who is a Philistine. His parents say, seriously, this is who, isn't there somebody else that you can have? And no, this is who I want. So he ends up with her. But in the end on this, it's going to be one of Samson's eventual weaknesses is not only to bring down the Philistines, but it brings about his own demise, and that is women. Another relationship with another woman. In this case, as you know, Samson falls in love with Delilah. And to eventually, what she does is she guilts Samson into revealing his secret of strength. And again, if you haven't read it, there's a process. He kind of tells her something and it's not true, and she gets mad at him because she made or he made a fool of her, and then he tells her something else, and she goes and tells the enemy that, and again it's not true, and she gets mad and said, you made a fool of me, and this goes on, and eventually wears him down. There's so many lessons to be learned there, but in this case for Samson, in the end, after losing, he eventually does tell her, tells her about the hair, and of course then his hair is cut, and he loses his strength. He is captured by the enemy. His eyes are gouged out. He's held in prison. And you know, I just remember this part from the movie, how devastating this part was of it for a man that is such a great position and doing such good things. And all of a sudden, here he is captured, and I can't imagine having your eyes gouged out, and what he must have been going through in this case, because he knows that it's his fault. But to his credit, he redeems himself in the end by bringing down the temple, and that whole sequence. You know how he manipulates it a little bit to get into this position, but he asked to be kind of chained to the columns, and his strength returns. And after asking God for that strength to return, and he brings down the temple, and the temple comes down on all the people, the leaders, the rulers, the people in it, as well as himself. It was the end for him. So, you know, it sums it up by saying that he killed many more when he died than when he lived. And Samson led Israel for 20 years. So what happens after his death? The pattern continues. Next week you'll hear sure about a woman, Ruth, and her leadership. And maybe things will change, right? Maybe. Any of you reading ahead? You know, most of us want to know God's plan for our lives. But we're not always sure how to find it. One common misunderstanding is the idea that God's guidance will come to us out of the blue, and that it has nothing to do with what we are doing now. But if we're always looking around for God's next assignment, we run the risk of ruining whatever we're working on right now. Fortunately, the Bible points to a kind of guidance that does not put our current projects in jeopardy. As you can tell from today's message and from many other examples in the Bible, we can see that often God's call came while people were completely immersed in the challenge of the moment. Okay? Keep that in mind. Often God's call comes while people are completely immersed in the challenge of the moment. So sometimes, you know, I think about that, and oftentimes we are challenged on so many things. I mean, we just got too many things on our plate. This is not going right. This is not the right time. Okay? I got too many things going on. Well, it's telling us here that oftentimes that's when God's call comes. And it's difficult for us, but oftentimes that's when the call comes, and that's our challenge. So, some lessons to remember. Any good teacher is going to have a sum up and tell you here's what you should have learned today. So that's what I'm going to do for you on that. Some lessons to remember. God calls us in the middle of our present obedience. As we are faithful, he gives us more responsibility. You know, if you're not being given more responsibility, maybe you ought to question what you're doing. Okay? Maybe you need to be more faithful. Second, God expands and uses the abilities he has already built into us. You know, we can do leadership training. We can do all those things, and all those are good things. But God has built you special. You're unique. You have special abilities. He has built that into you already. It's there. And God expands on that, and he can use it. It's not fully developed. Don't misunderstand me. It's not, you know, those are things that you have to develop and you do that by being into the Word of God. Third, God uses us in spite of our limitations and failures. You know, you look at these people, you look at Gideon and Samson, and you look at the people preceding that, and I mean, they all had failures. And all of us in our lives have failures, besides just the natural limitations that we have. But He uses you in spite of that. And to be honest with you, it's the only reason I'm standing on this today is because I fit into all those things. I mean, I've done things that obviously I am not proud of, and it goes back ways. You know, I still think about I can still remember times, and this is a man's brain and a coach's brain, I guess, but you know, I can still picture myself in a huddle on a basketball court talking to players when I said something that I regret to this day. You know, and if you ask the players, you know, they probably won't remember it all, but I do. And I remember, you know, and so those things, you know, I mean, you make mistakes, you got limitations, you got failures, but God uses you anyway. And lastly, you know, even those who make great spiritual progress can easily fall into sin if they don't consistently follow God. So I mean, that's the secret, is you fail, but you come back. There's nothing better than a great comeback. There's nothing more exciting as a person, you know, as a player, than when you come back after falling down. That's what it's all about. So, can you find yourself in any of this? I certainly can find them in myself. If you are outside of Christ today and you feel that you've been lacking in spiritual progress because of the limitations that you've placed on yourself, then I invite you to come today and take that leap of faith. Let God use you in a way that even you couldn't imagine, as we sing.